Welcome to another episode of the Middle West podcast. I'm your host, Taqib Musa. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. I'm joined by my guest host for the first time, Hamda Muhammad from Birmingham.
Hello.
Hamda is a third-year law student. She is part of MAB Youth in Birmingham. And Hamda, do you want to tell us something funny about yourself? No?
Oh no,
I just
don't
put you
put
on
me
the
on the
spot for
spot
no
like
reason.
this. Why? Okay, I think it's funny. I got lost in a desert once. Wow. Yeah, I got to the edge of my village and I just saw the Ethiopian, like the desert in front of me, and I was like, I'm turning back around. I hope that's funny.
That sounds almost murderous, but you
That
could have
sounds
died.
No,
terrifying.
it
It's
was
the desert. Um,
I'm gonna laugh about it. It was funny.
Fair enough. We're joined by our guest today, speaking about, well, all things generally, but in particular, we're going to talk today about the BLM movements, the George Floyd protests in the US. We're joined by the president of the National Union of Students, which is actually one of her many titles, including various other things in a previous life, student officer at the University of Salford, and interestingly, your bachelor's degree was in finance. So Zamzam Ibrahim, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for joining us.
Walaikum salam. I really thought you were going to go through my entire list then.
Yeah, I could
You
have done
should
that. I think
just
your
to
list
like
is
big her
definitely
up.
long enough. I didn't want you to make you feel too awkward. We try to be nice to our guests.
We like that. Humble.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah.
But the other thing is that we're not we try to be nice to you because we're not actually paying you. But one day we'll get to that point,
Inshallah.
inshallah. So I think before we get into the meat of the topic, I wanted to ask a little bit about your background personally. So what kind of, I mean, your bachelor's is in finance. This is something I ask a lot of our guests, is that what I found is that a lot of people start with one degree and that's supposed to set them on a trajectory, and then they go off in a completely other direction. So you've been with NUS for 4 years in various capacities now, I think.
Yeah.
And how did that happen? How did this segue kind of happen?
I don't know. I think it happened through like just like different streams of things happening, and just me being angry and wanting to change like different issues that I saw. And yeah, it just kind of like, I think one thing just led to another. Like interesting enough, like I think being a Black Muslim woman, sometimes like you just find yourself in situations where you just like, there are issues that you just want to change, and you don't really see anybody that looks like you or understands your experiences that can actually do what you need to see done. And I think for me it was just a case of like, if nobody's gonna do it, I can. So, and yeah, I think it kind of just led me down this route. But yeah, I did accounting and finance, and I'm just a logical person. I love maths, and the only reason I did accounting and finance isn't because I cared for accounting or finance or I wanted to be an accountant. It was just because I had no idea what to pick when I was going to uni. But I knew I had to go to uni. I don't know if Hamza can relate, but my parents were like, you're going to uni. You have this much time to pick, or we pick for you. And so I chose accounting and finance because I enjoyed doing maths. That was genuinely the real reason I did it. And so I knew at the end of it, actually, that at some point I was going to have to figure out what I really want to do. So yeah, and I think everything else just kind of worked out.
Do you see this as something long term, or do you think NUS is like a little break from your corporate lifestyle? Because no matter where you go, actually you'll be a trailblazer in whatever direction you go in. Because even in accounting and finance, especially if you look at like city firms and things like that, how many people of your background or who look like you are there actually out there? So you'll be a trailblazer anyway. So do you think this is your kind of stint into NUS, and then you're gonna go become a corporate lawyer or corporate financial analyst or something and make the big money?
She's gonna crack out her Superwoman like
Just
uniform and be like,
just chase the money now. Just be like, spent the last 5 years of my life calling out corporates and then just become one. No, I don't think so. I don't know. I think what I've like learnt from the last 5 years of my life is that like I love and I enjoy like campaigning and love organizing, and like I love change make work, and I just like, yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to happen in the corporate world, but I don't have the energy for that because it's just a whole beast by itself. And so yeah, I think for me, like, it kind of, this, I guess, segue into a different thing, because I really did think it was going to be at some point, like it was going to be, because when I first ran for president at my union, it was actually a placement year. Like I did it because I needed a placement. That was genuinely the real reason I did it. It's the only way I convinced my parents as well to take a year out of my degree. And then it just turned out there's something completely different, and something that I've just loved and enjoyed. And it's just meaningful work. Like, you know what I mean? At the end of the day, like, I feel like I've done something with the last 5 years of my life. Like, I feel like it's meant something. And I don't think I can ever go to like and do a 9 to 5 in the corporate world, coming back at the end of the day feeling like
all you
I'm
did
a
was
part
push
of the problem.
papers.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. So
I actually want to go back on a point that you made earlier in Thaqib's question. You said you felt angry and you needed to sort of see the change because you weren't seeing it being already done in the real world. I think, how does that then relate to sort of getting things done when people are placing barriers? Does that cause even more anger, or is it just more like, you're in my way, please get out of my way now?
I mean, I think honestly the thing is with like, I guess, barriers that come in your way, you don't see them until like you get to that point and you're like, oh, okay. But I don't know, I mean, for me, like the way in which I was raised is like, and I think maybe it's because of my having migrant parents and like the survival mentality. It was constantly like, just keep fighting, like don't let anything knock you, and like just to tolerate a lot of things, actually, just to like don't kick up a fuss about things, just keep going. But then when I went to university, I became a student rep, and my job was to like call out issues that existed on my course, and I took that job pretty serious, because the idea of paying £9,000, you know, for like and not to have like whatever needs we needed met, to me was like a little bit ridiculous. So I was given a little bit of power to do that, and I really enjoyed that like level of like solving issues. But then I think for me, then I like learned that the little issues that you're solving in your class isn't actually the real like issues that we need solving, in terms of like the experience that young Muslims have when they go to university, like, and or because I remember like there was so many Muslims on my campus, but like there wasn't any halal food, and I was like confused as to like why that is, and it was just because nobody has ever really raised it in the students' union, right? Nobody thought to put this on the agenda and pass policy to make sure that the union provides it. And like, so to me, it was like so many easy things that could be done that would change my experience had I started at that year. And so it kind of becomes a part of like, these are things that could easily be done. You just need to know how to navigate it, and like what to do. And I think for me, like it was like those slow things that kind of now led me to guess being able to like on my platform now, like work on like national policy to lobby government, and meet with ministers when to ensure that they include students, but not just like, you know, your average traditional student that we talk about, like, but I'm talking about a student that looks like me, right? That is going to go to university and is going to go through institutional barriers and issues. Like, how do we solve that? How do we make sure that their experience is better than mine, at least? Because it's not going to be perfect now, is it? But it's a long
At least
fight.
you've made some change.
Yeah, exactly, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in the last maybe, and again, I can only speak from how I've seen it, in the past 5-7 years, there's been a big change, at least on the NUS level. So there's been a coordinated kind of, it almost seems like there was almost an awakening. So a lot of Muslim students have been galvanized to actually speak up and go out there and take positions. And I think you were kind of part and parcel of that movement and pulling people upwards. But what happens next? So you're, I think, on a student politics level, I don't know if there's anywhere else you can go. You're writing policy on a national level. What do you see as kind of the next steps, or like, do you ever feel like you know, we've made all this effort, you've been working on for 5-6 years, literally since your degree on this, and then actually a lot of these problems still exist out there? A lot of people are saying that, oh, you know, now we have this, or, you know, Obama's president, so therefore but that's not true. Racism still exists.
Absolutely.
So does it almost, what do you see happening next?
I mean, for me, like, I mean, actually, my term's coming to an end. But I think I think one of the most important things to recognize is for anybody on a position of privilege or like a platform, is that it's never really about you, right? It's about what comes next after you, and how you continue. Because I think for me, the real success of the work that I've done will really come after I've gone. It will be like what's carried on. It will be what my successor works on and does, and like with the vision maintained. Because like you can't, like, change isn't about this very moment, right? It's that famous saying, like, this isn't about a moment, it's about a movement. And so essentially, like, there is so much work that needs to happen, and I'm almost a small cog in that, to keep it running for the little time that I'm here. Because the reality is, like, yes, like, there has been organizations like the Muslim Leadership Foundation, who was like instrumental in recruiting and training up young Muslims to like running their student unions, to train them when they start their roles as student officers. Like that's why we've suddenly had like a rise of young Muslims in positions in student unions. But I guess it goes beyond that. It's about what the work that they do. Like, I've like always said, I couldn't care less about black and brown faces in high places. It's about what they bring to that change, and how they implement the change that we really need to see, because that's far more important than full representation.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting point, because what I've noticed, being in my final year of uni anyway, is that once you're in uni, you sort of get stuck in this little echo chamber of like changing what can be sort of seen within your own student body, within that particular year group, or within that particular like cohort. How have you then managed to sort of break free from that echo chamber? Or if you haven't, then how can people do that who are in like the institutions of education already now?
Could you reframe that? Because I think,
yeah, of course, like you get stuck in like the echo chamber of like university. So like, for example, you're like campaigning for like a certain thing, but then after you finish your degree, or after you've done your campaigning, how do you then sort of just stop talking about that one thing where nobody really listens to you anymore, and you're just screaming at your own voice and your own whatever you call it?
Yeah, okay, I see what you mean. I think like I think it goes beyond like, the thing is, right, when you're at university, like, say you're campaigning about something that you have an issue with, right? I don't know, be it the sizes of your classrooms, right? Say like there's like 200 people in one classroom, you're not getting the support that you need, right? Like, that's an issue that you find as a student when you're there. I think it really comes back to understanding the root of like why that's happening, right? So for example, the reason that's probably happening is because universities are like overloading academics with like and not recruiting enough academics. Why is that happening? Probably because of the funding system in which the universities exist in, right? And actually, why is your academic not getting back to you? Probably because they're on a casualized contract and therefore don't have the capacity or time to be able to deal with the workload that they've been given. And then actually, where does that underlying issue lie? It comes from the government. It comes from years of funding. It comes from lack of regulations. Like, you know, I think for me, it's kind of like, it always goes back to like understanding where the root issue is, right? Because like there's like, for me, everything that anybody has an issue with, like I do a lot of like training for like activists and I'm like, you can campaign on anything, like tell me what like angers you, and I will tell you how to campaign on that. But like, also understand that always roots back to something, right? So when you leave university, right, those issues that were directly linked to your university experience exist and will play out in your community, right? And it goes wider than the whole like, oh, your children will one day go to university, you will still have that debt. Like it quite literally plays out in your community. It plays out in wider society, in the type of people that we have in our institutions, in like that run our country. And so I think for me, like it, like if you see something through a tunnel, like through a hole, you're always gonna seclude it to that hole. But what you really need to do is constantly just ask, like, but why is this? But why is that? And just go wider and wider and wider to understand.
I actually love that. That's a really cool framework of just looking at the bigger picture of things.
Yeah, always.
I like what you said before, position of privilege. So basically, the fact that you're president, you have this platform, or the fact that you've been in politics and have this platform, or that you're a great public speaker, and that gives you a certain kind of type of privilege. And I think this is something that's been in discussion a lot recently in terms of, I know we talked about kind of the kind of token brown people getting into, or BAME people getting into positions of authority, but also in terms of a lot of people are saying that, and we've seen manifestations of privilege in things like of COVID-19, for example, where coronavirus has disproportionately affected BAME communities. And a lot of people are trying to pin this, or a lot of media outlets are trying to pin this on, it's because they don't listen to instructions, or it's because they've been out at these protests. So that's going to be the newest thing that we're, that people have started to pick up on. Whereas the reality is actually there's a lot more structural factors. The fact that maybe they tend to live in more cramped conditions, or they tend to work those care worker or essential frontline worker jobs. It tends to be that they have less access to healthcare anyway going into the crisis, so they get impacted disproportionately. So how does this kind of point of privilege play out in the conversations you're having, but the communities that you engage with, predominantly on a student level?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, like, to unpack this narrative about like the reason as to, like, almost excuse Black and brown death, and but actually, but all other death is actually the fault of the government and the institution. But when it comes to Black and brown death, it's actually our own faults. I mean, that has itself, like, very colonial roots, and like there's a reason why the press, like, peddle that mentality, right? Because actually, like, to a lot of us, like, the death of Black and brown people is something that we see and has been normalized, like, across our media, right? It's something that you see, like, you can't go on Twitter without seeing something happening, right? Without seeing a Black person or a brown person either dead, hurt, or being verbally or abused in some form. Like, we constantly see that. Like, that's just become normalized to us. And I think for me, that's strategically done, that's purposefully done, to essentially almost make that okay for the British public, right? And so, like, what there's like the report essentially that came out, that's which I believe is so incredibly watered down, because obviously it came out during, like, this protest, the Black Lives Matter protest that's currently happening. What that report essentially shows, even in its watered down format, is that that Black and brown people are dying disproportionately, despite the fact that that they have they're that, like compared to essentially, like, their communities, right? Like, and this is, like, taking away the excuses of the fact that, like, Black and brown people, because they come from the disadvantaged backgrounds, are living in like in I've been speaking so much Somali today that my English is, like, absolutely gone.
I 100% relate to that.
You've got a Somali word on the tip of your tongue right now.
I do. I mean, if we could switch this to Somali, if you like.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay quiet.
No, but on overcrowded housing is the word I'm looking for. And so actually, despite taking out all those, like, excuses that have been given to us, like, about they disproportionately work in frontline in frontline roles, and etc. Like, actually, there's the issue is so much wider than that. Like, we know from reports that have come out of the health services that Black and brown people are less likely to be seen and all the issues and health concerns taken seriously when they go to the hospital. And so, like, actually, this is, like, a systematic issue that's existed for so long. And for me to bound that to the Black Lives Matter movement protests, which didn't start that long ago in terms of, like, protests in the UK, is actually just ludicrous. It's ridiculous, and all it's doing is essentially putting blame on our own deaths, which is essentially, like, caused by the state, on us, and, like, and just quite literally rehashing black on black crime in a different format. That's literally what it's doing.
I think one thing that I found really interesting was, I mean, BLM has been such a huge thing that's happening. Like, it's literally gripped the entirety of the US to its core. It's shaken. Like, there's protests in every single state.
Yeah.
I get notifications on my phone from few of the, and actually few of them are left-leaning newspapers. And actually, the notification I got yesterday was front page article: Madeleine McCann proven to be dead. And it's like, that was one person in a case that's been open since 2007. Not that it's not important, but is that frontline news compared to what's happening in the US, which I think there seems to be a kind of, I don't want to say a concerted effort, but it seems almost like an impression from the media that actually that's happening over there. That doesn't happen in the UK. Like, police brutality is a problem in the US. It's not a problem in the UK, which my understanding is not true.
No, absolutely not true at all. I mean, like, Black Lives Matter, like the entire movement was founded off a death, right? And like back in 2013, I believe it was, and so like it, and there's been protests that's happened again and again and again when people have died. And so, to be honest, like, George Floyd's death isn't the only death. In fact, there's been deaths here in the UK since, and so I think it's like, I think first of all, the narrative that like the deaths happen in the UK, in the US alone is absolutely false, right? I mean, like, there was the death of Mazi Mohammed that in Liverpool, where he was essentially killed by police. There's been Sean Rigg, whose case is quite literally similar to the death of George Floyd. Actually, his last words were, "I can't breathe." And so, like, actually, like, Mark Duggan, there's so many names that come to mind. And for years, there's been campaigns that have drove home like the issues of police brutality in the UK itself. And I think, like, the US is, of course, such a bigger scale, but the idea that we're alone like the US is alone in that issue, in that systematic racism is completely false. And all it's doing is essentially negating from its history, like the UK's systematic history of state violence. And so, like for me, all I've done in this current space is, first of all, like, I think it's important that we show solidarity with the US, and especially in their fight to persecute the killers of George Floyd, and to push and support them in the work that they're doing to really to really like hold police officers to account, because there are thousands of cases in which police officers are yet to be prosecuted, and furthermore, to lose their jobs. There are police officers that have taken lives, or still in their jobs. But I think for me, like the story of like Sarah Reid, for example, that to me is like a heartbreaking story, and that's here very, like, this is on our front doorstep, like here in the UK. And those are stories that people in the UK really need to know. That's stories that, like, we need to learn about and we need to understand, especially like these communities now that are coming out and are showing solidarity. Like, we've seen all over social media, like, everybody's put a black tie up, everybody is like tweeting Black Lives Matter. But to me, you don't understand Black Lives Matter if you're not actively learning about what Black Lives Matter means, and the role that you play in challenging institutional racism, in challenging state violence. And you can't challenge something if you don't understand it. And so there's a whole thing of like, and I put a thread out on social media being like, don't message me saying, are you okay in these difficult times? Go and educate yourself and learn about why I'm so angry and so upset. Because that's all I'm getting. I'm getting my friends and colleagues, and I use the word friends lightly, but just like messaging me being like, I hope you're okay, difficult times, and like not really understanding, because today they'll tweet Black Lives Matter, and tomorrow they'll just be like back on their normal stuff, or go to a protest and take and put something up. And it's not like the reality is, like, for myself and for Hamza, like, this is not, it's not a hashtag trend. Like, it's like our very existence is resistance. Like, And I think, like, for many of, like, especially the Muslim community, and like seeing it on social media, and like people coming out and who I've had like run-ins in the past in terms of like calling out their anti-blackness. For me, it's like really important to recognize that, like, actually, like, you will never understand the experience and the pain and the struggle and how deep it runs. It runs 400 years deep, and even longer than that. And I think, like, this, it's not something that we can sit down and explain, and none of us should have the emotional shouldn't need to explain, you know what I mean? Like Google it. It's so easy. It's not hard to, like, educate yourself now. Like, there are so many free resources available. There's so many films to watch, there's so many podcasts to listen to. But if you're not willing to do that, then you're a part of the problem. And, like, you should really just recognize that and understand that. So for me, like, it's kind of been a whole thing of, like, I feel like I'm talking a lot, by the way. So you're
no,
jump
I
in.
am. Yeah. I am literally, like, just saying, oh my God, I agree 100%. Only because since George Floyd's death, I think his one affected me more than every other one, every other American death and every other British death for some reason. Because I think it's as you said, it's the trauma. It is the suppressed emotion that we've just been putting aside as African American, or even, like, a part of the African diaspora, that our very existence to other people is a threat, and our very pleas to other people are sort of silenced and sort of brushed aside. And I felt like this is why his particular death has been a catalyst, and why there's been so much uproar, let's say, whether it is just on the surface shallow support with hashtag, or whether it is a genuine sincerity to learn more about what is going on with the Black community. But I think something that I was going through in my research and in my own unpacking of this trauma was how that we have never once put a name to the suffering that we have suffered as an African diaspora, was like post like American slave trade. And it came across this, and I'm going to put it in a question before I rant too much, is that there's such a thing as there's post-traumatic slave syndrome, and how even after the slavery has ended, not once did we get any help in talking about it. We went straight to more trauma, and we were freed, and then we went straight to more trauma, and then we were sort of given more rights, and then it became institutional racism and systemic racism that then oppressed us, then now that's manifested in COVID-19. So I'm just then saying is, why is it that Britain specifically is denying wholeheartedly and turning its face away from the fact that it's played a vital role in the trauma to Black lives in the UK and in America?
I mean, it's interesting, like, that you say that, because I'd argue that we were never actually freed, and I think that
we are in agreement of.
Yeah. And I just think, like, there is a mentality which is like often, like, we're, I guess, how can I unpack this in terms of, we're a product of our environment, and we are, like, for us, I've like, okay, I was born in Sweden, but I've spent most of my life in the UK, and I guess to a certain extent I replicate what I've seen in society around me, right? That those behaviors are normalized to me, to the extent that I, a Black woman, is anti-Black in a sense that, I mean, I could talk about, like, I can tell you loads of incidents in like, where I've, like, realized about my mentality and, like, why I think like that, and really try to unpack it.
You're saying when you say certain things, people accuse you of being anti-Black, even though you're a Black woman?
No, what I'm saying is, like, we're a product of our society, right? Like, we're living in a society that essentially upholds white supremacist views, right? That's the reality, okay. Right? And so even me as a Black woman who's grown up here and just has essentially absorbed everything around me, can be anti-Black. And, like, because the thing is, the reality is, like, we all have a lot of unlearning to do, just because there's a lot of things there's so much that we don't know that we're doing. Like there's just like the whole concept of unconscious bias. Like I remember I worked for a particular Muslim charity, and we did this challenge, right? And it was like the word association thing, in terms of like, what is the first thing that comes to your like mind when I give you a word, right? And like, bearing in mind all of us are Muslim, and we were giving like loads of different random questions, and they were like really like unserious questions, like ice cream, what comes to mind, beach, da 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 da. And then they said Muslim, and every single one of us said terrorist. And that wasn't because we think Muslims are terrorists. Not a single one of us do, but it was because that's what media's taught us, right? Like I think it's important to understand like that when you're drip fed something for so long and that's all you see, like even you yourself unconsciously will bury that information, and it really takes a lot for you to bring that out. And I think for me that was like a really interesting and important learning point, to be like, that even I was like, I guess to somewhat, and this is not to excuse, by the way, like any form of like racism and discrimination that exists in our society, and like but it's to actually just understand like where that comes from, and like to understand like where our mentality in terms of like being like agents in essentially in this world that comes from, and like where those behaviors are learned from.
Mm-hmm. I think you touched upon how there's media coverage in terms of like the words and the way that the media portrays a certain narrative. Going with that particular framework, then how do you think that the media's coverage of the BLM movement in America has sort of portrayed our struggle, whether it's positive or whether it is negative?
I mean, it hasn't been positive. Like in most streams, it hasn't been positive. They've been referred to looters, and they've been referred to like rioters, and there's been a question of like, you're destroying your communities, rather than really understanding why they're angry and why they are burning things down to the ground. And I think for me, like, that is almost, I guess, expected when from this media, from this press. It's something that we've seen here in the UK, like how our press has like I mean a simple example that, and like we're all familiar with, is how the press treated Kate Middleton, right, when she compared to Rachel. And I think that to me is did I say Rachel? What was it?
Because she's Rachel, and I was thinking about it, that I couldn't remember her name either. Her
Rachel
name is Meghan Markle.
Megan.
But she's Rachel Zane in Suits. Yeah.
Oh my
Meghan
God,
Markle.
I referred to her as Rachel.
Yeah.
Love that.
No.
But that's the point of like, she reached the highest point of privilege that you could, like, she was a royal, like she's literally a princess, and yet she still hasn't escaped.
Exactly, and I think, and like the media like completely annihilated it, to the point that she, like, her and her husband completely stepped away from their duties. And I think like,
and then they were blamed.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if that doesn't indicate to you like how racist, you know, like how like somebody made a joke the other day being like, they really came for Meghan and she's barely black, right? Because the reality is Meghan is white passing to a certain extent. And so like the like that shows you how racist and how nasty our media is, because like even the US isn't capable of that kind of like press, and it's something that like she spoke about when she left. She said, I had no idea what I was signing up to. I thought I thought I knew what I was going to expect, but the UK press is the nastiest piece of work, and it's true, they are.
Mm-hmm. I think what I've noticed about the media coverage is how in Britain, when I've been on Twitter, the British sort of racism has been called this sort of like undercover, over, like you don't really even see it, and how it's sometimes really gaslighting in essence, because it throws it back in your face and makes you feel like you're the one that's crazy. But in America, it's so obvious that you can't really deny that it's there. And I think that's why there's such a stark contrast, in my opinion, in the way that they portray the narratives. But in the same instance, it's like, why is it then that as a Black community, or even the BLM movement, that it's so demonized without having understood the causes, like you said before? Like, there's no understanding of that, and there's no room for people who watch the BBC or watch mainstream media to then go and Google things like, why is it that people are looting their own like communities, using that word loosely?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the UK is different context, simply because the divide and conquer mentality that was used to destroy our homes, our lands, is still very prevalent today, right? And so when we talk, and I say that when we talk about, like, for example, the Muslim community, right? Like a community that we're all a part of, like they exist in their own silos. You know, you have like the Pakistani community doing a little thing here, you have the Somali community doing a little thing here, and like they all exist in their different silos. And so there isn't like, there's like, we really like have gotten to a point where and I genuinely believe this is systematically done, right, to divide us. Because if we all come together, right, like think about like some of the most successful anti-racist campaigns in the UK. This is when they all organize under the term Black. This is when like the very few people of color that existed, which was predominantly the Pakistani and the Indian community, but also there was like loads of backgrounds from the Jamaica community, and so there were Somalians here, from specifically Somaliland, and those people banded together and worked together under one common cause, right? They were like, any form of injustice affects us all, right? And they really understood that. And I think what we've done, and what I'm seeing more and more, which is really disheartening, is that we are separating injustices and being like, well, this only affects Black people, so I'm gonna stay quiet right now. And when it's a Muslim issue, don't worry, B, I'm there. And like,
I got your back.
Yeah, and it's just, do you know what? And like, and I don't know if you've ever had this, right? I've been asked the question of like, and quite serious question of like, well, this isn't a Muslim issue. Well, how does the Muslim community help and like relate to the Black Lives Matter movement? And I thought, Black Muslims exist, you know? Like, that's not like it, like why are the two, like the whole framing of that question, and like to think that that's an absolutely fine question to ask. And I think for me, it's like, for me it's just completely baffling, right? And like the anti-Blackness within the Muslim community is like such a huge issue, and like I'm not saying it exists in its own bubble. Like, of course it exists in like wider society, but often like what pains me is when our religion, our perfect, Islam is perfect, right? Muslims are not, but Islam is perfect. Our religion is used to mask that racism, that anti-Blackness, and I think for me that's something that like that's where I draw the line. That's when I kick off at some points. But yeah, so I think for me there's a lot of work that needs to happen within the Muslim community. But I guess with as a community, as people of color as a whole, right, to be able to band together, understand like why we need to, like why our fight is your fight and your fight is my fight, and like the two have the same like oppressor. You know what I mean? There is no like, why are we differentiating between these two issues? Because the only person that benefits from us differentiating between our issues and our experiences, rather than banding together, is the oppressor. So it's that divide and conquer mentality, right? Like, that's technically winning. And so yeah, and I often find myself just honestly going back and forth about that very conversation.
Well, I think then I would go ahead.
No, sorry, you go ahead.
I was just going to say then, do you think that this particular BLM movement in this context is going to maybe create the possibility for us to start banding together? because of the fact that there's been so many outcries of like, we stand in solidarity with you and how can this have happened and things like that. Do you think we're moving in the right direction about having and starting those conversations, or do you feel like in some instances it might just start to die down after this because there's going to be other problems that are going to take precedent?
I don't know. I mean, I hope so, because obviously there's been a lot of like, do you know what? I think the lockdown has like, people are at home, and a lot of people are furloughed, and like lockdown has actually provided people to just sit down and read things and to understand. And like it was the first time I've seen, because like there's been these protests have happened before, but it was the first time that I'd seen people of color and white people staying muted and not talking about anything and just reading and sharing what other black people are putting out. And I think that was really, 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 really important. So I'd like to hope that there is change, but I think the only way you're gonna get change is for people to become uncomfortable with like being able to identify their own failures and their own biases, and like just being okay with that, you know, like the problem, like you're not a problem until you refuse to tackle it, right?
Yeah.
And so
one of the things I've seen this time, and I think you mentioned it about, in terms of people getting like some of the questions are just not on, and there's a frustration that actually every time these protests happen, the same questions come up, is that, you know, oh, but this privilege really, oh, but this, oh, but this, and I think one of the things you said is educate yourself, and I think there's a bit more of on social media where people seem to be just kind of sick and tired of this, where they're just saying that stop asking the stupid questions. And I think that's where sharing kind of old content that, or even content that like black people have put out, and sharing that has been quite useful in terms of these are not new conversations, right? That people are having. Like you come up with this idea of, oh no, but you know, white privilege doesn't exist in this place, therefore it's like, that's not something that you're like the first person ever to come up with. This is something people have been
talking about
banging on about for ages.
years and years and years. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think like there, and honestly, like the same message goes out every time, right? Like read and like understand how you can tackle, how you can call out injustice in your field. But and so like I think that the hope is, because like now for me, like I mean, being a part, like being a climate activist and like being a part of like the student strikes, like to me there's like the hope really lies of like young people being able to understand that and learn that, and them being able to unpick that, because at the end of the day, like those like us as young people are like the future, and so I care less about what an ignorant grandfather or uncle thinks right now, but more about like how young kids are thinking and what they have access to, and like one of the things like I've seen that's actually incredible is like how accessible like literature has become to like to access and to understand, and like just to decipher, and so yeah, I think that's there's and there's so many innovative ways. Like I've seen TikTok videos that are really funny but also teach you about like just break down like how you can be an ally, or the role that you should play to your to the Black community. And so there's just so many different ways in which information is being broken down and disseminated. So yeah, I guess I can only be hopeful that things are going to change, and I guess there is some happiness in the fact that the George Floyd's killer was prosecuted, and so have the other police officers that were with them. So there was some hope there, and I think I guess, like, do you know what? It's like it's a long walk, right? It's like it's a really long journey. It's not something that's going to be achieved in my lifetime, but it's almost like the only thing that gets you through it and like pushes you is to see those little small victories.
I guess that's a really deep comment that you said. We're not gonna get there in your lifetime. Like your lifetime is like, you know, many years left, 70, 80 years left.
I think just to add to that, like I saw a video, I'm not sure if you guys saw it, it was on Twitter. It was 3 black dudes. One and 2 of them were screaming at each other. One was like in his like 45, one was 31. And the 45-year-old, he was sort of really, really angry because he's gone through everything else before. And the 31-year-old was saying to him, look, listen, I'm only a few years older than you. In your lifetime, it hasn't changed. In my lifetime, it hasn't changed. And then he brought a 16-year-old and he was saying in his lifetime, it's not going to change either. And it just shows you how long we've been fighting this and how long we've been having these conversations. So I completely agree with Zamzam. It's not going to end in our lifetime. Because when we say educate yourself, education is not going to be in one hour long podcast or 1 hour long video or one book. It doesn't stop there. It's years. Like people who have PhDs in African studies and like all of this stuff have been doing it for like decades, and we're expecting people to unpack all the unconsciousness in like the 2-week span that this protest movement has been going on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the journey on like learning is to become an expert, right? Like I don't expect anybody to become an expert. Yeah. I'm not an expert, but also at the same time, like when I say it won't end in my lifetime, I don't mean that there won't be changes made in my lifetime, right? Because like I think understanding the I guess gravitas of the change that I want, like I'm quite literally asking to burn down the entire system that has existed since the beginning of time, and to rebuild it in a fair and just way. And like I actually had an interesting conversation with my sister about this, when like she put something up about like why is the Black Lives Matter movement controversial, and like for me it was like being able to explain that from the context, from the aspect of it's controversial because as long as people profit and succeed from that system, then they're never going to want to change it, and it's our role to make them change it, right? Because we are essentially the majority fighting against the minority, and so I think like for us, like we play that role in like constantly pushing and challenging the status quo, and like that's what you do. Like you're slowly like I guess like opening that door a little bit more for the next person to come along and do the same, and it's gonna take a very long time, but it's a struggle that we're committed to. It's a struggle that that is incredibly important, because I have to recognize the work that was done to make sure that I have the privilege to be in the position that I am today, and to live the life that I live right now. And though it's not free of injustice, right? It's definitely a lot better, and I live, and I'm grateful for those small privileges that I have had in my life. And I want to make sure that the generation that comes after me, my kids, kids, like live a better life, filled with less injustice than mine.
Preach.
I think that's really good, and I think that's kind of that point leads us very nicely to kind of a wrap up question, which is what do you think are the takeaways that our listeners should take away, especially those who are kind of their allies. They're not Black people themselves, or they might be people of color who don't necessarily think, and I think they're completely wrong in this, but they don't think this is our problem, which is something you hinted at before. Is a lot of people start asking the question, oh, but how does this relate to me? And a lot of Muslims, unfortunately, ask the question that how is this a Muslim problem, which is ridiculous. So what are your kind of takeaway messages to those people?
I mean, first of all, like if you see yourself as an ally and you want to show and you've been showing solidarity by going to marches, then you need to really understand like what an ally looks like, and go and learn about why we're angry, you know, like just understand why this anger comes from. And for me, I genuinely think if somebody genuinely goes and reads state violence, then they understand how state violence also affects them if they're a person of color, if they're a person from a minority background, if they're a person from a disadvantaged background. So like at the end of the day, like it's all linked, right? So I think it's important to recognize that being an ally is way more than like the hashtags, way more than going to the protest, taking a couple of selfies, and it's way more than just retweeting your friend. And I think like, what is that famous quote that, I don't know who said it, 1 minute, let me remember. It was I guess regarded to the Holocaust, it was first they came Wait, let me try find it.
First they came and
First they came for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists. I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade union. Then they
and then
came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by the time no one was left to speak up.
yeah.
And to me, that is genuinely as powerful and as relevant, right? Because like we often pretend like that it isn't our problem, it isn't our issue until it comes back and does a full circle. And at the end of the day, like I think, like we've all mentioned earlier, like it is our fight, it is our struggle, and if you don't if you don't do something about it today, it will most definitely affect you tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really powerful. I mean, there's been a number of very good sound bites and takeaways from this. So really appreciate you kind of joining us. And I think it's been a very good conversation. We're planning to do a couple more episodes with other guests on this. To
Brilliant.
kind of unpack some specific issues deeper. I think there was a lot more that we wanted to get to with you, but hopefully we'll have you on for a future episode to kind of discuss more about this stuff. I think, I don't know, which are you very active on Twitter? I've seen your Twitter um, is pretty active. I also forgot to mention, actually, I saw this on your Twitter. It's your birthday today.
Yes, it is.
So happy birthday. I think
Jazakallah.
yeah, we get into these serious topics and forget the little things. But one of the things was, yeah, I think people can follow you on Twitter at Zamzam MCR. That's ZAMZAM MCR.
Yes, that's right.
Um, you can follow us on at the Middle West PC on Twitter. You can follow us at Middle West Podcast on Instagram. We're not on TikTok yet because we're not quite cool enough, but maybe we're getting there.
One day.
Yeah, one day we'll get there. And you can email us with any feedback, ideas, guest recommendations, what you liked about the podcast, what you didn't, podcast at themiddlewest.co.uk. You can also engage with us on iTunes, on any other podcast platform, Anchor, etc. And you can listen to us on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcasts now, Pocket Casts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Oh wow,
We're now
everywhere.
releasing, yeah, we're pretty much everywhere, and you can catch the video now on YouTube because some people like to watch their podcasts, which I find bizarre, but you know, you do you. But yeah, thank you very much, Zamzam. This has been a really nice episode and really enlightening. Hopefully, our listeners will find it the same. And with that, see you hopefully very soon with another episode of the Middle West podcast.
Thank you.